So
it's
you're
not
like,
just a throwaway small segment of the Bible.
So when people get on social media and they go, well, there's only 3 verses in the Bible or that talk about homosexuality, well, that's just patently false. You see, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get, it's like if God were, if here's a hypothetical, if you're talking about a computer, right? And you're saying, well, this computer, it has the capacity to access good things and bad things and and someone gets on there and says, well, the Bible only talks about diodes once or twice. And so we're going to talk about the diodes that make, okay, there's a gazillion diodes in your computer, right? On your motherboard that make the thing work to do what it can do. And so
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. The entire point of this podcast is to help you grow in your faith. When you grow in your faith, everything else in your life comes into focus. When you grow in your faith, many of the problems you have simply go away. But in order to grow your faith, you have to realize it takes work. Fluff is not enough, and you need to start thinking for yourself. And our goal is to give you the tools to do just that. So welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast where you can grow. My name is Jesse Mayer. I'll be your host, but we cannot do this without the one, the only, the salty pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peak.
Hey everyone, so good to be with you today. I'm very excited because this is the first week where our Salty Pastor website is up and running. Good job.
TheSaltyPastorWebsite.com.
Yeah, thesaltypastor.com. So don't forget the THE at the front, or you'll go somewhere else.
Yes.
So thesaltypastor.com, and you can go back, and what I really like about it is the search feature on there that you can go back and search different episodes.
Yeah, we've had a team working on that. Big shout out to Bonnie, who went back through all of our old episodes and categorized them and found all the scripture references and all that stuff so that our salty crew could actually go and use that functionality. So she helped build that database, which was cool.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. So, hey, if you want to help out Bonnie and the Salty Pastor, go to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe. You can also, at the website now, you can support the Salty Pastor directly, right? There's a place you can just donate right there. So if you're not a part of Foothills, if you're out in the nation or international and you want to support what we're doing here, then you can just go to our website and give directly. We would really appreciate that and want to say thank you for doing it.
Absolutely. On Sunday, we kicked off our brand new series here at Foothills, but all of last week, we kicked it off in the podcast called Expose the Intimacy Illusion.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out in the podcast, we can't really talk about the pursuit of intimacy without talking about our sexuality. So here's your beginning of the week reminder that this is probably not a series you want your kids listening to the Salty Pastor about unless you have some questions you're ready to answer.
Well, we really laid the foundational kind of framework last week, and that is your soul and your body are linked. They are not separate things. They affect one another. And intimacy is the thirst of your soul, right? And your soul has been tainted. Adam brought sin into the world. Sin has now tainted your soul. And your sex drive is the most powerful way to, influence your soul. Intimacy is the thirst of the soul. The sex drive is the way we predominantly try to quench that thirst, especially once you go through puberty and get out of puberty. I mean, physiologically, your body is designed for sexual activity and sexual intimacy. I think they call it the limbic system, the limbic drive, which is the areas of the brain that have this, your basic emotions and, particularly those for survival, that flight or flight, reflex inside of you is located there. Just the survivability emotions, survivability instincts, those things are located there. And what's really fascinating is what's also located there is the drive to, procreate and create life. It's very, very strong. And so on the one hand, we have to say that your drive, your sex drive, your desire for sexual intimacy is a part of how God designed you. The issue, though, is that when we use it or pursue it in the wrong way, right, that drive can be tainted, just like your soul has been tainted and influenced in a way. It can have disastrous results. So I think what is interesting is that the way most people pursue sexual fulfillment don't realize the direct impact it has on the thirst of their soul. So that's what we're trying to dig into in this series, is say, well, what the world is doing is creating an illusion of how to quench the thirst of your soul. And yet God is saying something totally different. Do you know what it is and what it means? So how you go about pursuing or expressing this sexual drive within you, regardless of how powerful it is, very important, because it determines whether or not your soul will ever be satisfied.
Yeah, I think what's really important is I think of this song from the musical Hamilton. This came out a while back, and the song is called Satisfied. And they're talking about something different in the fact that Hamilton's marrying this other sister, right? That she's basically singing, well, you're never really going to be satisfied with her because, you know, you're always going to want me, right? And this is a very secular understanding of you're trying to get something, but you're going about it the wrong way, right? Like he was writing all of these different things. He had all these different pursuits, but ultimately there's this idea of like, no matter what you do, as long as you're running down this path, you're not going to be satisfied, right? And we keep getting sold the same bill of goods here in society of, well, just keep going further and further down this path of sexuality, and eventually you're going to be satisfied. Like, just keep going. Just keep going. It's a little further. Just go over the ridge and the next ridge and the next ridge and the next ridge, right? And we have to be really understanding that, just like Jesus said, your thirst will never be quenched by this water you're drinking. We too will never be satisfied if we continue pursuing the same thing and just keep listening to the world tell us, well, it's just a little bit further. It's just a little bit further. It's just a little bit further.
Right.
And so, I mean, all that pursuit of the wrong thing and lack of satisfaction is creating a lot of pain and suffering in people's lives these days. Why is there so much confusion about it? You would assume that if people realize they're not getting any happier, they're not getting any more satisfaction, they would go, well, maybe this isn't working, and they would turn around and try doing something different. But it seems like they keep buying the lie of it's just over the next ridge. It's just over the next ridge.
Well, I think there's a couple reasons, and that is, if I may use an illustration, is you break your arm, or you tear your knee or sprain your ankle or whatever. You go to the doctor, right? And they fix you up and they say, okay, you're gonna have to go through therapy, but the next week is going to be really, really painful, right? So they give you like some Oxycontin or, something like that, right? Some heavy duty pain meds.
Right.
So you take those pain meds, and what do they do to you?
They minimize the pain.
They minimize the pain, but I mean, they really they're strong.
Right.
Right. And so there's a danger. Some people get addicted to them, right? And they will take them even though they don't have any pain. And so why do they do that? Because that initial feeling is what? Very powerful. It's very strong. If you participate in sexual activity, it's very strong. It's very powerful, right? The emotions, the feelings, the experience, especially when you start, it's really, really powerful. And so I think people pursue that and get caught on that, number one, because it's powerful, but also because our society has continued to propagate the core values of the sexual revolution in the 60s, right? And so it just keeps spinning those up. There's no question that that's what our society values. In order for thought leaders and philosophers of the sexual revolution to make their case to get people to buy into it, right? They had to do something that was very important. And so You know how I've talked in the past, whenever you're making an argument or when somebody is postulating an argument, you always have to ask yourself, well, what are the unspoken premise? What are the assumptions being made in their statement? And what they did in order to propagate their position was they separated your sex drive, your sexual desire, your sexual fulfillment from your soul, right? And in doing so, they were able to argue that sexual morals of Christianity were outdated, they were prudish, and they were unnecessary, etc. You know, it's just like you don't need them. And this is what's really, really interesting to me, because let's go back to the illustration that I think is really important, is that some people will get these drugs and they love the way they make them feel, and so they want to propagate that, right? But the doctors, you know, if you go back and you say, well, you know, I tore my knee out and I went through my prescription for my Oxycontin, you go back and you say, I'd like some more. What does the doctor say? The doctor says, no.
Right.
And you go like, no, I gotta have it, you know, and they go, no. Right? And why do they say no? Well, because it's so powerful. Yeah, it deals with your pain, but once your pain heals, if you stay on it, it really not only makes you addicted, but it actually kills you.
Right.
And that's the problem, is that by separating sexual activity, sexual fulfillment, sexual desire from your soul, it allowed the, you know, leaders and philosophers of the sexual revolution to propagate this notion, because basically what they're doing is the opposite of what your doctor does. Your doctor says, no, you can't do that because it kills your body. But in the revolution, they say, do it. It has no impact on your soul. Do you see the parallel?
Yes.
And so that's what they did. It was unspoken. And how do I know that they're really good at this? Is because it's really fascinating to me that when you talk about morality today, everybody has narrowed the definition of morality to only mean sex, right?
Okay. Yes.
Like technology. When you talk about technology, oh, that only means computers.
Right.
You're like,
as opposed to smartphones and all the other things
all
we have.
the other gazillions
VR,
of things.
AR,
yeah.
all the things.
I mean, it's across the board, you know, there's tech in everything. This is a tremendous narrowing. And so what they did is they narrowed the definition of morality. And it's what's really interesting is that when you have morality about natural law in every other area, it's all in place. Nobody argues or defends rape, murder, torture, stealing, lying, cheating people, abuse, kidnapping, you know, mistreating children, you know, abusing pets. Nobody defends any of that, right? Nobody defends that. But that's all morality. That's what that is. That is morality. And what's interesting is if someone says, don't judge me, what are they actually saying? Like, they're saying, don't judge me about sexual situations, right?
Right.
You never hear a person who has committed rape or murder or abused their dog or abused children go, don't judge me, you have no right to judge me. What do they always say? I didn't do it.
Yeah.
Right? So isn't that interesting? The point I'm trying to make is that what the philosophers and thought leaders of the sexual revolution did is that they unhitched sexual activity from your soul. It'd be like going to a doctor and he says, well, here, take this Oxycontin, you know, for your ACL that you blew out, and you're going to have it repaired for surgery. And then you go back and say, I need more. And they go, okay, you can have all you want because it has no effect on your body.
Right.
Well, even now today, people would go, I'm not so sure this doctor has my best interest in mind. And that's exactly what has happened. The effect of the sexual revolution was to free sexuality from any cultural constraints. However, what it resulted in was not a enhancement, but it was a subtraction because it took intimacy out of sex. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the answer to finding true, authentic intimacy is to bring back together the spiritual as well as the physical. In order to understand how we can have a deep, long-lasting, intimate relationships, we need to have a theology of sex. And that's what is missing. And that's why I wanted to do this series, is to say, the theology of your sexual desire is that it's a reflection of the likeness of God. It's woven into your biology, the limbic system drives, your physiology, everything about you. It's all woven in there for a reason and a purpose. God made it pleasurable for a purpose. Those aren't the wrong things. The wrong things is when we try to apply it in a way that is unjust, unethical, unmerciful, because it's a narrowing. It becomes a narcissistic pursuit as opposed to a procreation or a pro-life, a pro-building orientation. And that's really important.
Well, it's like most things in life. When you take it out of context, it now no longer means what it originally was meant to mean, right?
So true.
I mean, I think of even this appears on social media a lot, right? We see arguments all the time when I'm perusing social media of like, oh, well, this Bible verse says this, or this verse means this, or it didn't mean that, right? Like they're trying to redefine verses, or they're trying to reteach people what verses actually meant, or they just dismiss them altogether and say, well, that was a different time. They didn't know any better, right? Talk to me a little bit about how we navigate all of this. Because I mean, nowadays where you can literally just throw a quote unquote teaching up online saying whatever you want about a verse, people are getting potentially confused. And then on top of that, you got AI writing stuff on top of all that stuff. And so it's like, there's just a lot of chances to get misinformation, mistaught, start challenging what you believe, and how should we be pursuing truth and understanding it for ourselves, because there's a high probability we're going to be told something wrong on social media every day. So this is
a common tactic of deconstructionist thinking, right? Is that they go into a single statement, right? And then they pick it apart to give you this notion that, well, that's not exactly what it meant, or it meant this, and da-da-da. Instead of just trying to, highlight its meaning, they get really highly specific and pick it apart, right? But what the flaw in this is that particular verse, when you start picking it apart, is what you're doing is you're imposing your position, your perspective on it, because that verse has to be interpreted in the context of every other single verse in the Bible, all 66 books. And you have to read all of them. And this is a real issue today because, there are over 100 verses in the Bible that directly address your sexual desire and your sexual activity. These are not just, if you add all of the verses up that deal directly with sexual practice, and all the passages of scripture that have stories and stuff where sex was a big issue in the story itself, right? Like Samson and Delilah or something like that.
Bathsheba or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. You're pushing 1,000 verses.
Right.
So
it's
you're
not just a throwaway small segment of the Bible.
So when people get on social media and they go, well, there's only 3 verses in the Bible that talk about homosexuality. Well, that's just patently false. You see, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get, it's like if God were, if here's a hypothetical, if you're talking about a computer, right? And you're saying, well, this computer, it has a capacity to access good things and bad things and da-da-da. And someone gets on there and says, well, the Bible only talks about diodes once or twice. And so we're going to talk about the diodes that make okay, there's a gazillion diodes in your computer, right? On your motherboard that make the thing work to do what it can do. And so that's what deconstructionists do, is they go to these hyper-specific things to try to poke a little hole in it so that they can say, aha, the whole
rest of it's
thing
wrong.
is throw it out. And this, of course, is narcissism and arrogance at its height. And that's why most people don't like deconstructionists, because they're exceedingly annoying. And I happen to be one of those people who don't like deconstructionists either. But you look at the Bible, you look at the Old Testament, Genesis 1, 26 through 27, Genesis chapter 2, 18 through 25, Genesis 17, verses 7 through 12, Exodus 20, Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, Deuteronomy 22, Deuteronomy chapter 23, Deuteronomy chapter 27, Judges chapter 16, 2 Samuel chapter 11. That's where David and Bathsheba show up. Psalms 51, Proverbs 5, Proverbs 6, Proverbs 7, Song of Solomon, Jeremiah 23:14. These are just passages of scripture that talk directly about sexual activity, right? In the Old Testament. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more that it's discussed and mentioned, right?
Right. And I'll put all these references that Pastor Doug's listing off in the show notes. So if you're wanting to go look at these and do your own research, which we always include you to do, or encourage you to do, you can do that without having to slowly play this back at 0.25 speed to get them written down.
Thank you, Jesse, for doing that. You know, and you look at the New Testament, and these are specifically mentioning sex, sexual fornication, sexual, different types of sexuality. Is Matthew chapter 5, 27, 23, Matthew chapter 15, 19 and 20, Matthew chapter 19, 1 through 12, Mark chapter 7, 20 through 23, Mark chapter 10, Luke chapter 16, Acts chapter 15, 20 through 29, Romans 1, 26 and 27, 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 Corinthians 10, 2 Corinthians 6, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 21, Galatians chapter 5, Ephesians chapter 4, Ephesians chapter 5, Colossians chapter 3, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 2 Timothy chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 12, Hebrews chapter 13, James chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 2, 1 John chapter 2, Jude chapter 1, Revelation chapter 2, chapter 21 and chapter 22.
We're going to have to turn you into an auctioneer after this, Pastor.
But the bottom line is that there are a boatload of scriptures. And so you need to go and read them all. And the reason why they do is that they want to try to get you to distrust this highly specific little tiny thing to create distrust for everything. That's what deconstructionists do. But then you have all the postmodernists. And postmodernists are of the thing is like, if I say it enough, people will believe it. I will say it enough, it becomes a narrative out there, and people believe it. There are people who believe things about President Biden that he never actually said, right?
Right.
There are people who believe things about President Trump that he actually never said. And that's how the game is played in those arenas, is that if you say it enough, right, it's got to be true.
Which is why we talk all the time about you have to do your own research. You have to don't just blindly trust anything. You need to think for yourself, right? And so it's like if you're walking that out, not just in your spiritual life, but in every aspect of your life, you're going to find less of those things happening where you're like, well, I heard President Biden said blankety blank, blank, blank. And you're like, oh, well, that sounds believable. So I'm just going to do that. And I tell my friend and I tell my friend. But if you're like, I don't think that's true, you go and look it up and you can go, oh, that's not true. And you're then thinking for yourself, right?
It's just exactly the same thing with President Trump, you know, and basically all candidates. You know, there's this really thing we might talk about a little bit on Thursday's podcast is that there's a kicker who's a phenomenal kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs, and he's a very devout Catholic. And he gave a commencement speech to a very devout Catholic school graduating class, and he affirmed, you know, marriage and sexuality based on Catholic teaching, and the other side went nuts about what he said. And what's so interesting to me is everybody says, well, he said misogynistic things, and I go, okay, well, time out. Just because you label that misogyny, Where's your proof? Where's your evidence? Give me a quote of something he actually said that says women are inferior, because that's the definition of misogyny, right? Where does it say that they lack value, they're less valuable than men? Actually, when you go and listen to what he said, you go, he said the opposite. But you're exactly right. That's how it works. I think my point is to bring all of these passages to fruition and let us see and know there's a boatload of teaching on this. And if we really want to understand how my sexual desires and drives fit with my soul and my nature, might be a good idea to read them all.
Get the whole story, right?
Yep.
I think one thing I've learned, especially since coming to Foothills, is you really have to not look at a passage and just go, oh, it says this, right?
Right.
Because like, even as we're trying to understand like the nature of God and whatever, the whole story is the entire Bible. You could look at a story, let's say when, Leviticus, he turns the city to salt, right? Am I quoting that right? Is it Leviticus?
Well, no, you're talking in Genesis, and that's where, Sodom and Gomorrah, where he destroys that.
Yeah. You could look at that and just sorry to cut you off. You could look at that and go, well, he's just a mean guy and he doesn't love anyone because he just turned an entire thing. But if you look at the full context of all the redemption and the ways he has saved people, and when he's trying to teach people and all these different things, you get a more full story of, yes, that was a punishment, but it wasn't, that's just one aspect of a much larger story. And he's been around for a very long time. So he has a long story to tell, and you can't just look at it at one day in the life and go, well, now I know everything about this person, right? Especially God, because he's unknowable.
Yeah, I think it's really
ways.
important to understand, like we always say, context is king, and not just the context of other scriptures, but the context of the time in which it was written,
right,
and the audience to which it was written to. And you have to understand all of these things, and that helps you bring understanding. But do you really want your most sacred writings? Do you want the writings that have the most power and impact, right, to be something that you just read and you don't have to consider? Do you want them to be things that you read and don't wonder, well, what exactly does he mean? Do you really want to read it and say, it's just, a bumper sticker cliche, and if I want to believe it or not? No, you don't. You want the words that give you the answer to life's deepest questions to be thoughtful and provocative and deep. And that's the beauty of the scriptures, is I've been reading them for a very long time, and I've been preaching on them for a long time.
You don't look a day over 21.
You're supposed to be honest, Jesse. You see what I'm saying? Is that every time I read them, there's a deeper layer of it. And it's a lot of what brings deeper layers to my understanding of scripture is what I read in another passage. Right. And I go,
you link them together, and then
the dots connect in my mind.
Well, I mean, even I'm going through Psalms right now, and like, if you read the little subheadings under some of the Psalms, it's like, oh, this one was written by David after the Bathsheba incident. And you're like, this one hits way different when this is what he was writing about, right? Or I'm kind of doing this thing where I'm going through 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings right now, and it's like, that's David's life and stuff. And so you see these Psalms that he's writing while he's running from Saul, and you're like, oh, this isn't just him complaining that, my life as a king's really hard. Like, no, he's out in the desert trying not to get murdered by an army, and he's like, hey, God, this is really hard. Will you help me
out?
And
it comes to life because you have the context under which it was written.
And that's like a very easy one-to-one context. It doesn't even interpret all the rest of it. So
that's what this series is about. One of the most important parts of understanding your sex drive and why it does what it does to you is asking yourself, what drives my sex drive? See, that's what the modern day people have done, is they just say, this is your sex drive. This is your sex drive. Nobody is asking the question, okay, well, what drives my sex drive? Right? And if there wasn't something else driving your sex drive, then why is it when you do something sexually, right, to injure somebody else, that person is wounded by it in their soul? Something that the sexual revolution people aren't telling us to be true is true. It's not true. It's not right. There's something that drives your sex drive. And that's when you start to understand your nature. And only when you understand your nature and you understand your sex drive together can you really start to live a more strong and a better life. And it really helps you avoid the legalistic aspects of your sex drive that create so much guilt and shame in a person's life, right? And so we'll dig into that more later on. I was just reading a book real recently. It says the kingdom of God comes with a house key. And it's this gal who talks about how she was converted to Christianity. She was head of the women's studies department at Syracuse University in the early 90s. She was a proud and out lesbian, right? And she had been pushing all this stuff. And what happened is writing stuff in the paper, and this local pastor writes this comment or criticism against her thing. And she read it, and she goes, it's probably the nicest criticism I've ever read before. And she goes, I want to read a new book, and I want to destroy these people who are my enemy, who judge me, and they're so filled with hate. She goes, so I'm going to go. So he invited her over to dinner with him and his wife and said, and she went over there and she goes, what I saw and what happened to me, basically, she said, was the most radical thing. And what's really interesting about it, she speaks in depth about the Obergefell decision of the Supreme Court back in 2015, 2016. I couldn't quite remember. But basically, it made same-sex marriage legal. It was written by Justice Kennedy. And in it, it basically says this. The basis of our decision to make this legal is that people have a right to define their own reality. So if someone wants to define their identity on their sexual drive or sexual desire, they now have a legal right to do just that. But what drives your sex drive is part of your nature and your natural drive as a human being to create life. And it's part of the drive within your soul to discover intimacy. All of these things are linked. It's important to see the instruction, the principles, the teaching of the Bible and all of these passages and more about your sex drive through the eyes of intimacy. It's not about positional, and this is really important. If you think that, well, my sex drive, I just want to control it or let it loose because, it's either God likes it or God doesn't, then you're going to think legalistically about your sex drive. In this circumstance, right, my sex drive is good. In that circumstance, my sex drive is bad. But do you see how the problem is that divorces your sex drive from your soul's thirst for intimacy with God?
Right.
This is where it gets really kind of, there's a lot of implications here, and that is that when you get married and you have sex with your wife, and then you conceive and you give birth to a child, is that God's blessing and favor? Right? So it's not just I can do it in this position, right? Because I'm under this covenant and I can't do it out there. What it does is when you think that way, it robs you from the real exploration, the joy, the pleasure, every good thing that God intended this to be. Right? So it's more than that. It's not about that. I don't want that approach to undermine the beauty of what God created, because the beauty of sexual intimacy, when it is being pursued with soul intimacy in God, can be something that is so wonderful and beautiful in your life. And that's what I don't want people who know Jesus and follow after him to miss out on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Pastor. We're excited to continue this study. I think it's super important for us to have an honest conversation about this and what it...
Oh, it's honest.
What the implications are in our lives, because you know, a lot of people do choose to get married and they do choose to be in relationship. And this can be one of the most impactful things in the relationship is whether they're pursuing authentic intimacy or just what the world's selling them. So,
which is what we really want.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Make sure you tune in on Thursday. We'll continue this discussion with more application and real world examples. And then obviously Sunday.
That frightens me.
I know that maybe that was a weird phrase to use. Not real world. Whatever. You guys know what we mean. You guys can think for yourself. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you on Thursday.
Keep thinking for yourself.